except for you, Cory. And just so we don't get any background noise. And if you could hold your questions till the end, we'll have a question and answer time.
So thank you for that intro. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. I think that was a pretty good introduction. I always like to start these talks by kind of disappointing everybody in letting you know that I typically present more questions than answers. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of my field. So my background in a nutshell is, how do you take very complicated conservation issues and how do you actually start to create applicable, applied, let's just say, actions to solve those issues? And almost all the time, that means having the community behind you from all different backgrounds, all different perspectives. And that is not an easy task. I mean, it is changing culture and figuring out what is the best solution for a particular place. And as you know, if you're from Cincinnati, I'm not from Cincinnati, but each place you go has its own sense of sort of regionalism and even patriotism. And so one of the things I like to talk about is, how do we come up with solutions that are going to be very broad in impact, but very sort of locally based, so that we all feel empowered and not overwhelmed with what we need to do, if that makes sense. I will give you a brief background. I am going to keep time though, because I tend to talk a lot and I lose, I just completely lose track of time. So if this goes over, everybody can start waving your hands and tell me you need to go, and I'll be perfectly fine with that. But I get excited a little bit. I've been told that I have sort of I think somebody said an exuberant presentation style, and I try to hold that back a little. But so let me tell you a little about myself, and that maybe will tell you what my mindset is. So I grew up in Georgia. So giving a talk about winter is not very easy for me, because I don't know if you've ever been to Georgia. I grew up like 30 minutes north of Atlanta. Winter was one day of snow and it melted by the next day, and then we had daffodils again. So when I think about winter, I have a very different perspective of what winter is. It also so happens that my father he's now passed, but was a Southern Baptist minister, very conservative, very fundamentalist, very not ecology, let's say. So when I left to go to the University of Georgia and focused on ecology, they sort of sold me off as a, quote, a tree-hugging dirt worshiper. I've embraced that as it happens. But what I've wanted to do with that is to help everybody understand that when I am approaching some kind of conservation issue, it's not from a political perspective. It's not even from a religious perspective. It's from a fact-based perspective. And I want each person that I talk to interpret it and process it within their own context. So I want to present a fact and let the people I talk to decide how are they best able to contribute to whatever issue I'm talking about. And so you might have guessed I have a very different perspective on climate change than most people do. So what I'll do now, just so that I don't delay anymore, I want to share my screen. I did present a PowerPoint. I may or may not get to every slide, and sometimes I wind up telling stories that are related, but I wind up having to skip those slides. So I'm gonna make sure I have my correct PowerPoint up. And it's a little bit, let me really quick make sure that I've got it presented to you in a way that makes sense. So were you seeing just a big picture of the Arctic right now? Everybody just shake your head. Are you seeing the Arctic? All right, that means that I've gone way too far forward. So now, now you should be seeing a picture of some icicles and the title. Is that right? Perfect. Okay. Initially, I had this titled, I think, Winter. This is a new presentation, by the way. Because of this talk, it inspired me to create a brand new presentation. So I decided to entitle this -4, and I'll explain that in a little bit, or, because I like alternative titles, How to Survive Winter and Subsequent Seasons with Increasingly Unpredictable Weather. We can stick to just winter, though, for now. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is to set the scene. When we think about winter, what I want you to think about is the Earth is now facing away from the sun, and it gets cold. And if you are an organism, plant or animal or bacteria or whatever, and you have cells that are filled with water, cold weather is very dangerous, because what happens when water freezes? It expands, right? And when it expands, that means that the cells within your body are going to rupture, which is bad news if you want to stay alive, right? And so most animals, plants, anything living, they tend to have adaptations to allow them to stay above freezing. So winter poses issues, right? That's a problem for most things. And for me in particular, as a plant ecologist, I have a master's degree in animal ecology, so I know a little bit of both. But winter's a fantastic time for me, because what it means is everything's sleeping, it's resting. So professionally, I don't have to do that much, because everything is just trying to go dormant, right? What I wanted to do, though, through this talk, I'm going to go through the animal and plant groups and just give you snippets of what I think are the most interesting stories. And just so you know, I'm a pretty good judge of what's interesting or not. And so you can rest assured that I've presented the most interesting stories from each of these groups, okay? Some of them, I will tell you, I go down rabbit holes and I will learn some new piece of information, and then I start going really deep. So I might get a little excited about some of this, because I've been, like I said, this is a brand new talk, and it's got me excited about this topic, okay? Why aren't you progressing? There we go. Okay, my favorite, plants. One of the questions, okay, I've got to move on my screen. What you don't see is that your faces are all over the pictures. I'm going to move it. Plants. For me, plants are incredibly adaptable in winter. So right now, if you look out your back door, what you're probably seeing is, if you're looking at native plants, you might see some cedars, like right up here with the snow. And cedars are conifers, so they have these really tiny needles, and they don't lose a lot of water. That's the whole thing with conifers. They just have these small needles, which are their leaves. They photosynthesize, but they need very little water to photosynthesize. So in the winter, they don't need as much water, so there's less risk of them freezing and the water getting bigger and rupturing those cells. But amazingly, they also produce glycerols. Basically, they produce antifreeze that prevents their cells from freezing. And that -4 degrees that I mentioned earlier, -4 is actually the lowest that we know. -4 Fahrenheit is the lowest that we know most organisms can actually survive and still function. Now, their cells aren't at -4, but the ambient temperature is at -4. And I want to go through all the different ways living organisms have wound up overcoming that temperature limit, right? You know, like maples, your oaks, they drop their leaves in the winter. They're just going dormant. They don't want anything to do with the cold. They're kind of like me. Let me just sleep through the winter and I'll be fine. We'll come back to that, though, because my favorite cold weather plant is skunk cabbage. Who knows skunk cabbage? How many of you know what skunk cabbage is? Oh, please tell me some of you know. It's the coolest plant you've ever seen. Oh, okay. Skunk cabbage is a kind of arum. It's related to like well, Jack in the Pulpit, right? It's related to skunk cabbage. It's this plant. You might find it in Hamilton County. It's not really in Claremont County. It's kind of spotty. This is about as far south as it occurs. Believe it or not, this plant, and if you can see my cursor, you see my cursor moving around over here on the right. This plant on the right, that's actually the bloom. That is a flower. I know it doesn't look like much, but get a load of this. So this skunk cabbage comes out in about December. And in its cells, remember learning about mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell? Remember learning about that in like high school, college biology? What's incredible is skunk cabbage actually have this particular metabolic pathway that does nothing but generate heat. So in February, this thing will start blooming, and those little metabolic pathways start working so overtime, they produce heat that actually melts the snow around it. The flower smells like rotting flesh. So what do you think is going to be pollinating this thing in the winter? Flies, right? Anything that can smell that carrion is going to be flying into this flower. It's warm. It's kind of smells gross. It's like fly heaven. And suddenly this thing's attracting anything that wants to eat anything dead is going to be flying into the skunk cabbage. It actually produces heat. It's not cold one minute, and then suddenly it's melting snow the next. And it's just cellular respiration doing that. It's as close to warm-blooded in plants as you can get. And that to me is, it's just cool. I don't know how else to say it. So plants have a variety of ways of surviving. They either just toughen out or they start producing their own heat. But here's the important part. Come on, slide, you got to change for me. If we were to look at soil temperature, now I know a lot of you don't think about soil temperature, but we plant ecologists really like soil temperature. I'm going to explain this, and then you'll suddenly get why I would suggest you plant your shrubs and trees in winter or in fall. This is a graph. Here's temperature over here, and this is depth in inches underground. And there are a few different soil temperature stations across the state. OSU is one of them. And if you look at how warm the soil is, what you find is that the freezing point of water is right here, right around 32 degrees. But once you get here, about 8 to 20 inches, somewhere in there, about a foot under the soil, it's not freezing anymore. Even in the harshest of winters, it's around 35, 36 degrees. The important part is that oak trees in particular, 36 degrees tends to be the lowest they'll grow. And the roots of those oak trees can get up to 5 feet beneath the soil, right? 60 inches, which means that at any one point in time, the oak tree in your backyard, its roots are so deep that it's still actively growing its roots. The shrubs that you put in fall, what they're doing right now is they're growing their roots as much as they can to prepare for spring. Then they can stop that root growth and focus on leaves and flowers. So when we suggest people to plant their woody species in fall, like the shrubs, the trees, it's because fall is the perfect time for them to grow all of their really deep root systems. So what are the plants doing right now? Well, a lot of the plants have gone to bed, right? They're dormant, but the trees and the woodies, they're actively growing. It's just, you don't see it because all of that growth is under the ground. And again, for a kid who grew up in Georgia where it really doesn't get that cold ever, to know that there are things that are surviving the cold is just so cool to me. Now, I said before that I did have a master's with animals, and I did with mammals, and I do have my notes. Again, this is where I'll start getting excited. Mammals are interesting because we're warm-blooded, right? So our cells produce so much heat that we harness that heat to keep our bodies warm so that we don't have to bask in the sun to stay warm. Bats, oh, I use them as the model for mammals because they kind of run the gamut on mechanisms for surviving winter. I'm going to go in order. My favorite one's over here. This little dude, this little cute guy. I mean, look at that smile. I mean, people might be afraid, but look at his little face, though. That is the cutest little thing. That is a small-footed bat. You know, they call them that because they have small feet. Scientists are not the most creative people. And what's interesting is these are the tiniest bats in Eastern North America. So when winter hits, they're not sleeping in caves. They're sleeping in any tiny crack in any small little rock outcropping they can find. Smallest of cracks, right? Now, I have a point for giving these three examples. Below that, this little dude is the small brown bat, which you would see if you're out in your yard in the summer and you see a bat fly by overhead, it was probably one of these guys. They nest in caves or roost in caves in the winter, so they hibernate. Both these guys hibernate. But these guys hibernate deep in caves. And when I say cave, I'm not talking about like, you know, your Ruby Falls caves like in Tennessee, your Mammoth caves. Any small, you know, opening in the soil where they can go underground is perfect. Now, the reason I mention these two is as we see the global climate increase, the effect of that increase on these two species is going to be very different because this guy, the small-footed bat, is above ground when he's roosting during the winter, right? Any small change in ambient temperature is going to hit this guy first. But the little brown bat down here, he's in caves. He's much more protected from changes in ambient temperatures than is the small-footed bat, which means it's really difficult for anyone to decide what might happen to a particular species when global warming progresses. And I'm going to get to global warming and climate change in a bit. And the answer, it all depends on their ecologies, their behaviors, where they decide to roost in the winter, how they feed, where they feed, do they migrate or not? So there's not a single best answer because even within a single group of animals like bats, just the fact that this guy's nesting in tiny holes in rocks above ground and this guy is nesting deep in holes underground, that can drastically change what effects warming of our climate would have on these two. So it's just not a straightforward answer. So again, more questions than answers. But I want to share one species that just, I wish I had a dozen of these in my house. I love them so much. These are the red bats. Now, if you are a member of the Nature Center and you've ever wandered around sort of between Krippendorf Lodge and the old swimming pool, and if you are a member, you'll know where the old swimming pool is. There are beech trees in that entire area. And red bats love roosting in beech trees. These are dead beech leaves here because they match, their color matches, it's hard to see them. Red bats might be the coolest bat. Well, again, trust me when I say they're the coolest, the prettiest. They migrate, first of all. So they have the strategy of when it gets cold, let's just get out of here. Let's fly south like the birds do. But we sometimes still see them here. The reason for that is when it starts getting cold, instead of nesting or instead of hibernating in a cave or in a hole in a rock, they actually will drop down to the leaf litter and roost, they would call it, in the leaf litter and go into what is called torpor, which is basically temporary hibernation. So torpor is when an animal's body goes into hibernation for potentially just a day, and then it comes out. So these guys start by migrating, and then if it's really cold one day, they just go into torpor. And if it's really warm the next day, they come out and start eating again. So if it's wintertime, let's say between now and March, if you see a bat out flying around, it's probably a red bat, because these guys have just been waiting for those warm days. And this is about as far south, or I'm sorry, as far north as you would really see them out during the winter. But come late February, early March, if you go to the Nature Center, go to Krippendorf Lodge and the beech trees around Krippendorf Lodge, just look for the dead beech branches hanging down and look straight up into those dead leaves. You'll have to look for a little bit, but you'll see these little guys. They'll nest in maybe 1 or 2 bats per little leaf clump, but they're just roosting. They're waiting for it to get a little bit warmer so they can fly out, catch some insects, and then fly back in. And if it drops below 0, they just drop to the floor, burrow under the leaf litter, and they hang out for a while. So they're the only species, by the way, that will actually roost in the leaf litter. You could step on these guys if you're walking through the forest, just because of the way they go about surviving winter. And they're beautiful. I mean, that color is, it's just gorgeous. I love them. So moving on from bats, I want to finish this this sort of sweep of animals. Insects. Insects are, there's so many different types that it's hard for me to tell you how insects survive winter. So I wanted to tell you my favorites. Again, it's me giving the talk, so I can do whatever I want. My favorites I put up here. Monarch butterflies. Who knows what they do? Just mouth the words if you know what they do to survive winter. Yeah, right there, Kitty. Got it. Migrate. They fly to Mexico. They get out of Dodge. The last migration of the summer, or I'm sorry, the last generation of the summer is the migrating generation. They actually have a different wing shape. Their wings are narrower and longer, and that helps them fly south. Now, here's what's interesting, and I'm going to probably give something away that I want to talk about later, but it's okay. These guys fly to Mexico, and it's a combination of both day length changes and temperature changes that tells their brains, their tiny, well, they would call it neural ganglia. They don't really have a brain, but let's just say brain. Their brains detect the changing day length and the changing temperatures and say, fly south. So every individual of that migrating generation flies south until it gets to Mexico. What's interesting is it's a very specific region of Mexico that they fly to, and nobody knows how they all go there because none of them have been there before. So no one understands how they manage to get there. They get there, they hibernate, or I guess hang out there because the temperatures are warmer. And then once the day lengths get longer again and the temperature warms up again, something in their brains, and again, we don't really know what, flips, and they only fly south or north. They only start flying north back to Eastern North America. What's really interesting and also very concerning is that temperature change that they detect in Mexico that tells them to fly north. It might be as slight as 4 degrees Celsius, which means these little guys are detecting changes in ambient temperatures as small as 4 degrees, which means if we continue to see the increase in global temperatures that we have, which is 3.6 degrees, we might get to a point at which these guys fly south for the winter and never fly back because their brains simply don't detect that it's time for them to fly north again. So in their case, flying south to survive winter might actually be one of the sources of their potential extinction because the temperatures simply don't tell them to switch and fly north again. which is, terrible to think about. I will talk about that a little bit later briefly. Bees, like this little mason bee you see down here, they just live in a little hole like the hole of even rocks, for example, or your house. They'll even build nests in the empty stems of like Joe Pye weed or any plant that has like, the really big hollow stems. They'll build a nest in there, and their eggs just hang out all the way through winter. So they're overwintering as eggs, which is why we tell people, if you have a pollinator garden, don't cut your dead stems. Leave those stems standing, because they might be filled with mason bees for the next year. Now, alternatively, what's interesting is mourning cloak butterflies. This is my favorite butterfly species. I love it even more than monarch. Mourning cloak butterflies hibernate as adults. They will find holes in trees. They will find loose pieces of bark, and they will then just hibernate all through. Whoops, what did I do? They'll just hibernate through the winter. In the spring, if you see a butterfly come out, let's say March, you see a butterfly and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I see a butterfly? Almost undoubtedly, if you're in Cincinnati, it is a mourning cloak. So their entire survival through winter is just find a cavity and go to sleep. So in terms of hibernation, I would say these guys come the closest in the insect world than anything else I know of. They just kind of set up shop and wait. What's interesting is their bodies start to produce glycerol. Again, same compound that makes their cells, it increases, or I guess decreases, the freezing point of their cells, so their cells don't freeze. So these guys can get below freezing temperatures and their cells don't freeze, which again is, to me, just an amazing kind of trait of this tiny little butterfly that you may not otherwise think twice about. Some organisms, like the praying mantis here, these guys will actually lay their egg sac. You've probably seen the praying mantis egg sacs. The females will lay an egg sac, and the egg sac will just freeze hard as a rock through winter. And in the spring, when the temperatures warm up, the eggs will hatch. So these guys, the adults are all dead at this point. These guys, the adults, are living in holes in trees. These guys are all in Mexico, and these guys are hanging out as eggs in tubes or in old plant stems. What I do think is interesting is there's a fancy term. I do like throwing out fancy terms just to prove that I have a PhD, because otherwise you wouldn't know it by how excited I get. There's a term called isometric shivering that mourning cloaks and other butterflies will do. It's basically their muscles shiver and produce enough heat to raise their body temperatures 15 degrees above ambient, which means if they want to fly, which they need about temperatures of about 50 degrees to be able to fly, 50 minus 15 is 35. So at 35 degrees, if these guys start shivering, their muscles are suddenly warm enough to fly. Which it's an insect. Like we think of, I don't know, for me, when I first discovered this, I think of people shivering. This little butterfly shivers enough so that it can actually fly around and look for food. With, again, though, part of this talk was to discuss what's happening with sort of global climate change. What we're seeing with insects, and this is perhaps, in my opinion, the most important, or the most, I don't know, dangerous or interesting or severe impact of global warming. What we're seeing is that pollinators, bumblebees, moths, butterflies, all of those during warmer winters tend to emerge a little bit sooner than do plants. If you were to warm up a plant, it would take longer for that plant to come out of the soil and start growing again than if you warmed up, let's say, a bumblebee in the soil that's hibernating through winter. What that means is that as global temperatures increase, you're seeing the pollinators come out sooner and sooner, but you don't see the plants necessarily coming out sooner and sooner, or at least not the same plants that the pollinators use. So they call this the asynchronicity of pollinator systems, which basically means that as temperatures increase, even by a degree or two, pollinators come out of there, whether it's coming out of those little hollow stems, whether it's coming out of a hive, those pollinators come out earlier and earlier looking for food, but their food plants haven't come out yet. They haven't actually emerged from their overwintering. So you see plants that are no longer able to be pollinated and pollinators that can no longer find food. And that's already been shown. And so one of the things we try to tell people is when you hear on the news, for example, that there might be a 1 or 2 degree increase in temperatures, that doesn't sound like that much. But in terms of like the asynchronicity of these pollinator systems, that's huge, because it means the difference in just a few weeks of when the pollinators come out looking for food that isn't going to actually come out of the ground for another couple weeks. But the monarchs, right? Let's look at monarchs. I'm going to look through these. One of the things that we've discovered about monarchs and climate change. So we know that they are waiting for temperature cues before they come back to Ohio, but we also know that each year these monarchs go further and further north, which makes sense, right? Like if we are actually getting warmer in the summers, and if summers are lasting a little bit longer, these guys can keep going further and further north into Canada. But what happens is once they get there and winter begins and they get that brain connects that, oh, we have to fly south now, they have a much longer way to go to their overwintering grounds in Mexico. They have to face a lot more issues, many more challenges. And most of those more northern migrating populations don't make it because they simply had to fly too far. Now, this again is one of those results that really hinges on like a 4-degree difference in temperature. Something that small will completely determine whether or not these butterflies are making it back to Mexico safely, and then also determining whether or not they fly back to the United States at all. And so again, I don't tend to be an ecological pessimist. I'm an optimist by nature. But what I do know, given my background, is that a lot of these animals and plants, let's just say their sort of temperature adaptations are so fine-tuned that a few degrees difference is huge for them, whereas for us, it may not seem like such a big deal. Reptiles and amphibians, I don't want to fly by these guys. I do love my reptiles and amphibians, but they have similar adaptations than plants, believe it or not. Most of these guys that you see on your screen right now have some sort of antifreeze property in their blood that prevents them from freezing. You could have a wood frog or a bullfrog or a painted turtle, and they are underneath leaves right now in ponds, and they are surrounded by water that is hovering just above 32, but their bodies aren't frozen because they're producing antifreeze. But here's what's amazing to me. All of these guys, as they begin to produce this particular compound, it's mainly glucose and urea for amphibians. So they actually keep urea in their cells, which most organisms secrete in urine. They keep it in their cells to prevent their cells from freezing. It's like salting their cells to prevent their cells from freezing. But what that means is it produces uric acid over time. You guys remember learning about uric acid? It also creates lactic acid and uric acid. What happens when you get like a muscle cramp? What's building up in your muscles? Lactic acid, right? So basically, any of these amphibians over winter, it's like they're living in a permanent state of muscle cramp because they've been building up this urea to prevent from freezing, which means when spring comes, they get out in the sun, snakes especially, and they just want to heat up so that their cells will begin metabolizing all of that urea so that they can then look and forage and find some, find food, find a mate. Which means in early spring, when you see amphibians, frogs, toads, snakes, when you see those guys out, they are so susceptible to predators because they can't move. They're so cramped and cold that they can't move. The trade-off, though, is that they were able to survive the entire winter in places where nothing else would be able to survive because they had this acid, this urea in their cells. What's amazing, though, this is one of those things that'll blow your mind. We like to think that we created antacids as humans, but painted turtles, they will actually dissolve, their bodies will start to dissolve parts of the calcium in their shells, and that calcium acts as an antacid to reduce some of that muscle spasm. But that also means their shells are getting thinner and thinner during the winter. But turtles, two things: not only do they have antacids that they use from those shells, like they take the calcium out of their shells, but they will sink to the bottom of the pond and put all but their tail out of the mud on the bottom. And have you guys heard of one of the terms would be cloacal respiration? So what's a cloaca? Oh, all right, now I'll see some smiles, because amphibians, reptiles, and birds have cloaca. Cloaca, I think it's Greek actually, the term means sewer. They have one opening on their rear end, one. Everything comes out that same opening. It's like their anus with all the other openings back there combined. Turtles, they will go down to the bottom of the pond, they'll put everything but their tail out, and their cloaca, effectively their anus, has blood vessels really close to the surface that can actually take in oxygen from the water to allow them to respire. That's fancy talk for saying, as my daughters would say, they breathe through their butts during the winter. Which, if that's not mind-blowing, I mean, it's true, it's weird, it seems like something from an alien movie, but it helps them protect every important part of their body, and they just leave their tail sticking up. Cloacal respiration, that's another $5 term. When somebody asks you what it means, just say it means breathing through your butt. But they do it. You will never hear another presentation where somebody says that phrase, and I'm kind of proud of that, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm just going to move on from that. I've never taught about cloacal respiration, but I kind of like it. Fish. Okay, fish, you would imagine, have a terrible time in the winter because they live in the water, right? They are absolutely immersed in water. You might have guessed, more antifreeze properties. Their blood produces very specific proteins that, again, reduce the freezing temperature of their blood and their cells so that they can live in sub-zero temperatures, and their cells simply don't freeze because they have antifreeze building up in them. And that includes freshwater fish. So this is a rainbow darter you see here. It is a native to Ohio streams. We have it at the Nature Center in our streams. I think it's one of the most beautiful fish in the world, and it's one of our natives. but there are also Arctic fish. Like, anybody heard of Arctic char? I think for a while people, you might have heard of people eating it. The antifreeze properties produced by Arctic char are, let me make sure I'm right, they are 300 times more effective than artificially produced antifreeze that you might put in your car, which means they can live in the Arctic and their bodies don't freeze because they're producing antifreeze. It's mind-blowing to me. They do not breathe through their ears, but they produce antifreeze, and to me, it is just, I love it. Now the birds. Now I know your cat's not even paying attention. I see the cat now, not even looking at the bird picture here. Birds in winter, you might have noticed. I often, believe it or not, get asked about migrating birds in winter. Migration is a really tricky topic because in many populations of birds, they will migrate. Like, you may have a population of birds in Canada, they'll migrate a little bit south, and then a population of the same bird, like the titmouse here in, let's say, Ohio, might migrate a little bit south. So everything sort of shifts. It's not always the case that every single member of a species all flies to the same place. Everything just sort of shifts a little. Some things do actually fly all to the same place, some don't. In most part, though, birds tend to migrate first, and the ones that don't migrate, they simply rely on down. It's like having a Patagonia down coat on year-round, and that's how they stay warm. Now, one of the exceptions to that, and I didn't put a picture in here, are waterfowl. Ducks, for example. Ducks have a really weird system for surviving winter. In their legs, and I'm going to try to show this in a way that you can understand. Let me see. In their, how do I do this? In their legs, like if this was a duck leg, right? It's a very big duck leg. You would have arteries and veins going up and down their leg, right? And let's say this is this is their flapping little feet in the water. There's going to be arteries and veins coming up and down their legs. Makes sense, right? Everything's got arteries and veins. But with waterfowl, their arteries and veins are all wrapped around each other, kind of like a spiral, a double helix. What that does is when blood that's coming away from the heart and the arteries, it's warmer, it goes around and around the veins, the water or the blood coming into the heart. And as the blood comes into the body, it gets warmed up by the blood leaving the body, so that the blood coming back into their body from their legs is warm before it ever gets to their body, which means they don't get cold when they have their feet in the water. So they can be floating in water and it can be less than 32. And for whatever reason, the surface of the lake isn't frozen because it's either moving or there might, who knows what else. But they're warmer than you are on land because the water's not going to be 32, and their body's making sure that they don't cool their blood down before it comes back into their body. It's called counter current. What's the counter current circulation, where they just make sure that their arteries are wrapped around their veins so that their blood coming into their body isn't cold from being submerged in really freezing water, which is crazy to me. I'm still amazed. I'm one of those kids. Well, I'm an adult, but I was one of those kids. I was just amazed at everything. All my friends had, Star Trek and Star Wars. And for me, it's like, there's some crazy stories about nature that are way weirder than all the sci-fi things you're watching. One of the things, though, about winter is what we have seen is that migrating birds are actually shifting their migration by 2 days every single decade, which means after, let's say, 100 years, which most of us will be gone. A few of us might still be left after 100 years, I like to believe. We could have birds coming back or flying a month before they were supposed to, because a lot of birds have multiple cues that they're looking for before they migrate. Day length is one of them. The position of the stars, the moon, the sun, believe it or not, but also temperature. That's what they're waiting for to tell them that they need to fly south or they need to fly north again. And because of the warming, it's basically confusing a lot of the birds so that they begin shifting spring migration earlier and earlier. Now, here's what we're seeing. We are absolutely seeing birds come back earlier each spring. But so far, we have not seen that same kind of asynchronicity that I talked about with pollinators. For whatever reason, we haven't seen a big difference between the food supply of birds in the spring and that asynchronicity as compared to the pollinators coming out too early and missing the plants they pollinated. So we're still okay as far as birds go, but we do see a response every decade by 2 days. So that's happening. And I'm looking, yep, I should be good there. So that's another impact. And here's where it gets a little technical. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. What I wanted to show you is that since 1920, if you were my dad, for example, you would say, well, it's naturally, we get these warm and cold spells. This is just natural. It's not global climate change. This is nature. Well, yes, nature absolutely goes through warming and cooling spells. Absolutely. But what we're seeing is that the mean difference is going up and up every single decade, which means the average here, if you look at it, is way higher in terms of the degrees away from the mean or degrees away from the average than it's ever been before. So we're seeing those natural levels of the changes and increase and decrease. Everything's been pushed up. You still see nature operating, but it's operating in a much different scale than it did before. Here, same kind of a deal. I showed this graph because this is just January. I did this for us. The average is this blue line here. Again, up and up every single decade. So yes, there is absolutely global warming. Now, that isn't the same thing as global climate change. And I do want to point out that despite what a lot of people may think, I am, come on, why aren't you changing? I am not a ecological pessimist. I am an optimist. I think that we got ourselves into some trouble, but we'll get ourselves out. Here's what's going on right now. So, and I'm going to have to, right now, what we're seeing is that there is approximately 414 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is what you might have heard before is a greenhouse gas. Think of it as a blanket around the earth that just holds the heat in. That's really all it is. But water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. It holds heat in, right? What we're trying to do, and by we, I meant most conservation scientists, like the Paris Climate Accord, what they're trying to do is to decide, okay, we still need certain things as people. We don't want to stop all, economic progress, but we need to figure out what level should we keep things under. We need to go a little slower, be a little wiser with our natural resource use. What that has meant is, at the end of the day, we want to try and stay beneath a 3.6 degree increase, Fahrenheit increase of global temperatures. 3.6 degrees. Let's keep everything, any growth that we have for the next 70 years under 3.6 degrees. That's the goal. The reason that's important, and I may skip some of this, I'm going to tell you some ahead of time. Well, we'll keep going. I'm going to do this. That 3.6 degree temperature, if we hit that, if we achieve that, we will still see at this point in time, by 2070, more than 3 months in Cincinnati that's above 90 degrees, more than 1 month above 100 degrees, at least 2 heat waves a summer, warmer winters, and a growing season that's 6 weeks longer. And that's if we stick to the minimum of what we've decided we need. I hate all the doom and gloom. What I've heard, though, again, I'm going to throw my father under the bus here. I would hear when it got cold, well, so much for that global warming, it's really cold outside. Well, remember January 2019? It was one of the coldest Januaries on record. This was one of those news bits from that. The exact same month, record temperatures in the West and the Southeast. What we've learned from climate change, from this global climate change, is not that climate is always warming. And that's why we've switched from saying global warming to saying climate change. What we've discovered is that this increased temperature at one point in time leads to unpredictable weather later on. So what might be really cold in one area now is going to potentially be even hotter someplace else. Record cold in Ohio in January of 2019, record heat in California in the same month. One of the reasons for that, and this is new and exciting and terrifying all at the same time. If you were to look at the Arctic, and I'm trying not to go over it, this is an important point. In a normal year, that's on bottom. So look at this positive phase graph. What this shows is the air currents around our Earth, right? In a normal year, air flows in this kind of oscillating up and down fashion, right? As the Arctic warms, as the globe warms, just because of the density of heated air compared to cooler air, what that means is that circulation of air changes shape. And unfortunately, that means it becomes, look at this top phase, what they call negative phase oscillation becomes much higher. So what you see is colder air being blown further down than it should be, and then coming up much sooner than it was supposed to be in your low pressure year, your positive phase year. So it makes things more unpredictable. What we're seeing is that over time, you get more, and seems like a complicated graph, but it's not. See how low these blue lines are getting over here? What this is showing us, this is while it is complicated from NOAA, but I'll interpret it for you. As we get closer and closer to 2020, we're seeing more frequent negative phases that are more negative. What that means is that we're getting an exaggerated oscillation more and more frequently because temperatures are going up. That change in temperature directly leads to the way evaporation happens, the patterns of evaporation, and because of those currents, where that where the water that's evaporative, where it gets blown to, which means we're seeing rain in places we can't predict basically where rain is going to fall. It's getting less and less predictable because of those oscillating air currents that are bringing different temperatures of air. And that's leading to, in 2070, potentially 30% higher flood risk in Cincinnati, more flash floods. And what's really concerning, this last part is what most scientists are really concerned about, less rain specifically during the growing season, which we've seen, at least in some of the, if you look at past like wheat yields and corn yields based on temperature and precipitation. Sorry, I'm going to my notes because I'm getting excited. We could see a 16% decrease in global wheat yields and a 6% decrease in corn yields. So farmers who weren't interested in this it's really concerning for me, because you will see a decrease in the agriculture that we produce in our region. If was anybody alive? This is probably a bad question, but I'm going to ask it. Was anybody alive in 1937? Because I can't see everybody's pictures, and you all look at least 21, if a day. So this was downtown Cincinnati, 1937. This is the exact same location in I think it was 2019. You guys recognize that? That right there is where that guy was in his boat. This was a 1,000-year flood, 1937. A 1,000-year flood doesn't mean it happens once every 1,000 years. It's a crazy name. It means that in any given year, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of having this kind of a flood. By 2070, we're going to see significantly more 1,000-year floods, which means we're going to have to get used to a lot more of these catastrophes, right? Now, this is the last slide. And I do want to say, I am not a pessimist. One of the things that makes me feel more optimistic is that for those of us, I moved to Cincinnati, I married somebody from Cincinnati, and I've now adopted it as my home. I love this town. We have gone so far above other cities in terms of setting goals for ourselves. We have a Green Cincinnati plan. We have specific goals set to reduce our carbon footprint in the next, well, it depends, the next 20 to 50 years. We've got goals set for a few different time periods. But we as a city have come together to say this is something that we're concerned about, and it's something that we're going to plan for. And a lot of other big urban cities like Cincinnati have not done that. And what I really love, again, considering my background, I might have gone left in terms of politics and going to school. And my father and a lot of conservatives are not there. But in Cincinnati, what I love is that we have a bipartisan approach to this. Believe it or not, we do have representatives from all across the political spectrum, all identified that they have very specific goals for our cities in the next 20 years. We don't all agree on why some of these global warming trends are happening, but we're all agreeing on the path forward. So I am as optimistic about our city as I could be. And I think of all of the adaptations that plants and animals have for surviving winter, I am absolutely confident that we as a population will figure out how to adapt to global climate change, and we will change that future for ourselves. So for what it's worth, you have it from, me as a scientist saying, I am nothing but hopeful, but I am concerned, but still very hopeful. And so I'll end the talk there, and I will take any questions you might have. I'm not a climate scientist, but I would love to take whatever questions, and do my best that you can throw at me. So if you guys want, you can all unmute if you have a question.
So do the cardinals that are always here in the winter, do they have that antifreeze in their bones or their wings?
It is actually the cardinals that you see right now. Most of the birds in your yard, they are surviving purely on their feathers. So a lot of our northern birds, they have down. They are wearing down jackets year round. And so they're not bothered at all by the cold. What they do when you see them fluff up, they're just getting new air under their feathers so that they can warm that air up, and then it's just this nice little fluffy layer of air around their bodies. So that's how most of the cardinals that you see in your yard are surviving. That's what sometimes you think you see a chubby bird in your yard in winter. It's not chubby, it's just all fluffed up because its feathers are bigger.
I have a
Yeah,
question.
Janet. Yeah.
I have a couple questions.
Mhm.
One is, like, you were very endearing towards the bats. Uh, when I was your age, you know, bats didn't bother me. I used to go crawling through caves and bats would be flitting around, and you know that. But since COVID, my question is, I mean, I don't know when that picture was taken with you holding the little bat, but are these bats that flit around and that, you know, are nearby us, are they dangerous in terms of spreading COVID, since they originated from China with those in those fish markets with the bats? Tell me about that.
So I can actually answer this based just on what I know about mammals in general. The bats that we have here are Microchiroptera. I cannot believe I pulled that fact out of my head. They're basically a completely different group of flying mammals than the bats that you heard about in Asia. They're all called bats, but it would be similar to comparing foxes and dogs. They're just very different. So the bats you have flying around your backyards are absolutely harmless in terms of those kind of viruses. Not to say that we may not find one day that they catch it, but they're a very different group of bats. So, and we don't have any of those bats that were under sort of investigation as being at the heart of COVID. We don't have any of those here. So
Oh.
our bats are tiny, they eat insects. They're just altogether different, for sure.
And I have another question, and then it's not really related to your talk, but other people might be interested in the answer to this question. We have bird feeders
I'm married.
What? What?
I said I'm married.
We have bird feeders out.
I'm giving you a hard time, Jan. I'm sorry.
I know. And we were getting, I know, I just, you know, go with it. We were getting a lot of those, what I forgot what you call those birds that were invasive. So I stopped feeding.
Starlings?
Starlings, thank you. So I stopped feeding the birds for 2 weeks, and I was gonna go get one of those starling-proof feeders. But then I was reading on the internet that if you put up feeders in the winter, you gotta be really careful and make sure you clean your feeders really often. And you know, it's hard to clean the feeders in the winter. So I was wondering, if I don't want to clean my feeders once every 2 weeks, should I just forget about feeding the birds until spring?
So if you're, do you want me to tell you what I do?
Yeah.
I feed my birds. If I see that my feeders are just particularly dirty because it rained or whatever, I will bring them in, wash them off, and then put them right back out. But if they don't look dirty, I don't wash my feeders more than maybe once a month at most. That might be, but I'm not an ornithologist, but I've never seen an issue. So I feed mine. I make sure I always have feed in mine, suet in mine, and I rarely ever, in the winter, I can tell you I never clean my feeders. I'll just say it. I never clean my bird feeders in the winter.
Do you have a problem with starlings? Have you had a solution to that?
I do have a problem with starlings in the summer. They'll come through. They don't go to my feeder for whatever reason. I tend to get the songbird. I tend to get bird food without black oil sunflower in it. That's just a small like millet. And for me, that's tended to solve both the starling problem and the squirrel problem. I get much fewer squirrels and starlings. And you know, the black oil sunflower is great. It attracts a lot of things, but I tend to get the seed that doesn't have that, and I haven't had an issue with them attacking my feeders at all.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, because we've been having a big problem with the starlings. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah,